Morning, Pierre. Welcome.
Good morning from a very cold London, minus 1.1 at the moment, and a bit of snow on the ground compared to people at 32 degrees in South Africa.
Well, as you can see, that's not exactly today's background in our picture, but it's not far off at the very moment with a few clouds in the sky. So welcome. I think, you don't need much of an introduction. I think just adding quickly, most people can see if they want to follow you further after this conversation. They can find you on LinkedIn and the BIM initiative. But if I go back to our original chat that we had, I think you're one of the first mentors for the exceptional BIM rules of engagement. And we spoke about keeping abreast of BIM. And I think in general, that's a very broad term within our built environment if you're going to speak to an entire team. Now, my background being a quantity surveyor, I think I want to narrow this series down to quantity surveyors, where we focus more on what I look at as the exceptional QS. And let's unpack exactly what that is. And I think those listeners listening, they'll also agree that there's no doubt. I think that there's still copious amounts of challenges within our collaborative way of working, not just within BIM. But if we unpack really what BIM is, I think you can all consider that there are still liability exposures. There's this thing about ownership of issues, protection of intellectual property. And then we've got to have the authors contend with the rights to the contractual framework, which, remember, is still fundamental to fostering and promoting digital innovation. So this particular topic, I think I want to have that hard-hitting discussion, as I think you brought the topic up. Let's discuss this now in a live application. And just for the listeners, I just want to put it out there. We know that BIM is a process that involves the generation and the management of a digital representation of a physical functional characteristics that comes straight out of Google, by the way. But building information models that are developed are now becoming a shared resource to support the decision-making from cradle to grave. And this has all been very much indoctrinated at the design stage. And then we're seeing it go into construction and maybe into the operation and maintenance, and now with a huge focus on this digital twin. BIM does, in the old ways, allow the architectural to do the design work more traditionally, where project participants come in at the end or halfway through. And I think there's still this opportunity or this challenge that I think quantity surveyors are left out of this discussion. And as I saw the list that you gave me, there are probably 5 topics I really want to challenge today's discussion. And that's looking at first what you mentioned is discussing some of the key elements. How do we share this collaborative way of working? I'm not just talking about common data environment, it goes deeper than that. And how do we use that platform to enhance connected sharing of information? And who are the benefits out of that? And then last of all, maybe we can just discuss a little bit about the issue around technology.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. More than happy. I think that all of those are very relevant in our market right now. One of the areas I do think that traditionally construction is very conventional. We have a series of standard contracts. There's been a couple of variations, design build, design bid build, and the various contracts around the world, JCT, JBCC in South Africa. And each of these contracts, in fact, instead of providing the constraints which eases the flow, in my mind, are still becoming very constrictive. And that contract, because it defines what the relationships are, that's where we start with almost on the back foot. And we divide up the project into a series of work stages, and they typically have been very discrete. Concept, initial design development, construction documentation, building, and then as in use. And it's been nice little benches. But the problem that we've got is you pick up on the issue that the QS hasn't been involved. Now, I talk about this regularly we keep talking about the team, the BIM team, the project team, including the client all the way down to the last supplier. And there's some of these chasms in our market right now, is that we're not all including right the way down to the supplier. That comes in later. And the net result is we're losing the benefits in some ways of the contractor, for instance, being involved early, making better decisions, so we're not value engineering later.
Yeah, and while you're on that point, I'm going to raise that particular slide that you're talking about, because I think what we're talking about here is, where does this QS fit into this whole process? And unfortunately, as you can see, you're talking about these models that are shared between, and information that is shared with the rest of the supply chain. But I think if you look how I've just left the QS out, who still seems to be working more in a traditional way. And unfortunately, I think what you just highlighted is that if we look at asset information management or even facilities management, a large part of the costs go into the entire life cycle during the operation and maintenance, or call it OPEX. Yet the benefits need to extend beyond the financial savings that are presented within this BIM environment. Yet the quantity surveyor is still working in a 2D environment.
I think, Vaughan, that it is. It's a 2D because that's the comfort zone. In other words, I get a fixed document. The moment it's 2D, it's set. We don't have the dynamic of it being in 3 dimensions. But I do think that the one area, and as a QS, you'd probably agree with the disagreeing with me. For me, a quantity surveyor is not the QS as a quantity surveyor, but as a quality surveyor. And let me explain why I see that, is that the quality surveying is actually, I have a choice of products, or I have a choice of performances. The QS can then advise on exactly that in the lifetime that will get you the best return on investment. If it's a retail exercise, we're going to replace that element every 5 years or every 3 years, depending on the change in the dynamic of that retail environment. And it's the appropriateness of that. And that's the one part that we seem to lose, because I don't have a skill. And we spoke about the 4D, 5D and everything else. I don't have that skill. I do because I deal with the data. But what it is that it's disconnected. And what we need to do is draw on those. It's the maturity of the BIM. It's the resources that we're dealing with. We need to maximize on that.
Yeah, but and I love the slide, because exactly, you asked, what is the role of the quantity surveyor? I think the slide puts it pretty well, is that it's someone who solves a problem who didn't know he had one in a way that you don't even understand. Now, if we unpack that, call it the Google wizard, the cost manager seems to be a new term that is creeping into this world. But again, I think we've had cost managers around for decades. We've even had cost engineers around for decades. And I really like this new term that's jumping in. We call it the digital QS, the digital quantity surveyor. And how do we unpack what is that digital QS? And I want to just say this, that, and I've said this in the BIM rules of engagement too. It's a new decade. And it's a new year. It hasn't been a very interesting start to a new year for many of us. But I think everyone in this construction food chain, in particular quantity surveyors, as well as estimators, don't leave them out, we should be looking at a future of an industry where we're asking ourselves, where does the next 10 years hold for us? Not just as individuals, but as an industry. And I think depending on the QS's expertise, I think even I feel a little bit shaky, and you should be concerned. And why I'm saying concerned is that most quantity surveyors have entered this world just like me. You've gone, you've done a degree, or maybe you studied at a college or a technicon. You've worked hard, you've got well paid, you've worked your way up the job, up the career ladder to become maybe that senior cost manager or that senior quantity surveyor, hopefully watching your salary jump at the same time. And mastering those skills along the way that were determined to you by the company that you work for. Yet, the QS qualification today, the difference between a QS qualification and the experience, I think, in this new digital way of working, is becoming even ever more stark. And we're seeing these young rookie colleagues who have now recently graduated and joined these workforces that have spent hundreds of hours learning this new technology, not through the company, self-taught. If you look at the recent blog on post on LinkedIn recently, Almost 87% of people are doing online learning with technology because the company they work for does not promote new technology advancing. And I understand that because it's expensive and it's consuming resources that they don't understand. And I think most experienced QS hands in the field out there that are looking out to their future, they're looking at a future they don't even recognize. I feel I don't even recognize the future. Yet these jobs are fundamentally changing, even from architectural design. We're looking at mapping systems, machine learning. And we've witnessed what it can do across platforms such as LinkedIn or even YouTube. But never before is the new and established QS profession being so polarized. And I think it's becoming to a point where it's almost becoming decentralized. And, you know, there are those who are boldly claiming that they hold the key to the future for quantity surveying. I'd like to know what that is, because I don't think we can simply afford to lose the rich experience of our traditional quantity surveyors. We simply can't afford to lose the richness of our young rookies that are coming into the industry with these streamlined tools for the future. And they are the next generation of quantity surveyors. Sorry, I just went on a rant there, but I think it's going into exactly what you're talking about. And this is the hard-hitting aspect of where, you know, we need to discuss, where does BIM fit in? What are the challenges? What are these key elements? And what technology should the QS actually be starting to engage with? Not just looking at his tool of choice to do quantity takeoff and estimating. There's a bigger picture there. And I want to use your example. You said, you know, let's look at it in a live environment.
Right. So I think principally it's in that issue of collaboration. The part about the contract is it says it's defining a whole bunch of things that people are doing. But in the collaborative world, the part behind certain people in the project team, like the QS, is that effectively they establish a snapshot in time. But we are working in a world of massive change and dynamic, the change management side of the project. And right now there's a disconnect. The QS takes that snapshot, 2D, whatever, and generates an elemental estimate, a bill of quantities, whatever the particular document, the cost engineering components of it, but it's then disconnected. It exists. But the model is developing the whole time. And that's where in the collaboration, the immense benefit is that if you draw that in, that inclusion, the benefit starts to accrue down the chain and back up the chain because you're getting feedback. And in every single case that I've looked at and been engaged with people in discussion, etc., in real terms, is that if you establish that collaboration, you reduce your own personal workflow, the amount that you have to turn out. Now, the example that I like to use here is that if I take an existing building and I'm reworking it, the story behind this is that there's an amount of data that's already available, both in geometry and in data. And for me, everybody benefits by making an informed decision on the basis of those two things. The story about clash avoidance rather than clash detection, the preemptive part, and that's what collaboration should be doing. Like a rugby team, people get to think in the same stream. Now we're talking about the traditional methods. I'm a strong traditionalist. I do believe that the skills that I learned doing manual drafting, taking the pen and shaking it to get it to work, releasing the paper in the evening, having register bars, all that, is all part of understanding the process of layering and levels. Now, is that something that you couldn't learn, self-learn? Absolutely not. You could end up doing that with no problem, but it's the fundamental understanding that starts to work. And in the same way, it goes to AutoCAD and using layers. And then you find nobody uses the layers properly. So when I come to BIM, I can't use that information natively. I haven't got the interoperability because it's not structured properly.
Yeah.
The cascade down the line is that the QS suffers from exactly the same thing. Is because it's not ordered, they can't glean information out of the model. So then they go back to that. I do think that within the conventional parts, in the construction industry, only 4% in the UK of all the construction companies are tier 1 contractors, and they're various names. Sir Robert McAlpine, Kier, Mott MacDonald, you name it. But they turn over 70% of the total turnover in the construction industry. So it's a huge chunk. But what about we go to the other end of the extreme? 52% of those little companies are the white van, relative only in the UK, people would understand what the white van is. And they come around and they do the little house alterations. Would they not benefit from exactly those skills that the QSing service could provide in terms of costing? We've got this ability with models, etc., and sharing it back. The net result is that the entire industry and the beneficiaries will be the public. And I think that we're in an ecosystem where this is put out. The same thing with suppliers. We can extract that. That becomes.
I mean, you used that word extract, and I'm just going to go back to that slide that's showing on the screen now. We spoke about these model components and these assemblies that are being used by, let's say, the larger commercial streams. And I'm using a perfectly house here as an example. In fact, this was a house from Janine Strochen who won the QS competition a few years back here in South Africa. And this is a typical residential home. But if you look at the type of information that's coming out of there, nothing on this image is new, right? We've seen all of this. But there's this word level of detail that is now creeping into, and for almost 4 to 5 years, the word level of detail, LOD, LOR, LOA, whatever you want to call it, little a, little o, little l, doesn't matter. It's now suddenly become levels of information need. Now suddenly you're throwing another acronym at me, and I've only just got into the difference between little o and big O. And, oh no, that's all out the window. Now we're working with levels of information need, because that's ISO compliant. You're just going to throw these QSs into a state of vapor. Now they've got to work with something else. And one should even ask the question, and I keep raising this again, levels of measurement. No one speaks about what is the level of measurement at different levels of development. How much of that elemental classification is required at the early stages? And we always talk about giving the QS levels of LOD 300, because that's where he should come in, where he has enough information. The level of measurement is way before the amount of information that is needed when you're working at risk. And every QS listening to this understands what it means to work at risk. And no one's paying him for that, yet he's got to come out with this thumbsuck and generate a cost based on, let's say, the back of a cigarette box. And he's got to put that information together and make it viable. Now, the challenge here comes in that we ponder on certain things such as, yes, but we don't have the resources. We don't have the software. I think there's that saying again, the industry in general is full of stakeholders who are driving to improve the sector and innovated through some of these toughest challenges that we're facing. Yet, we still see too many silos. And you mentioned earlier this dysfunctionality of a team that talk about BIM in the corridors, and they talk about digital information and the massive crossover or the cross-section of BIM maturity. We talk about common data environment standards and aligning it with ISO 19650 and the likes. Yet, where's the cost factor? Where's the tangible benefits that lie for the client, and where does the actual quantity surveyor, call him the digital QS, really start to play a valuable role in this entire life cycle?
Right, so Vaughan, the first thing I'm going to kick off with is standards, standards, standards. And I've got to tell you that
put it up for you.
I'm very excited about ISO 19650. One, because I'm in the UK. Two, because we've gone through the BS 1192, which was one of the world leaders about the level 2. We're now going to a standard. Now, the question originally, I said to myself that the ISO 19650 is great. One world, one standard. But in reality, I think that there are a number of regions and region-specific components, but that's another whole issue about how I see that working. But the part about standards is I pick up my phone and say, there's something that is highly standardized. You can be incredibly creative if you're on an Apple platform, on a PC platform. Because of the standards, because of the constraints, it means that people work in the same manner. Exactly in the same way. The SMM, 2, 3, 4, whichever version you want to be following, etc., depending on obviously project types, etc., is that it's standard. You can expect what's going to come out because it's constrained and defined. And the confidence that that provides is exactly when we go back, the more the standards are there, like using Uniclass, is that everything has an input and multiple beneficiaries. This is really the part about BIM for me right now, is that if I put in information, I'm the owner, maybe self-appointed owner, but what I do is when I share it out, it's debits and credits. I've put it in once, and a number of other beneficiaries don't have to redo that because they leave the ownership to me and the benefiting to them. We do have to define that. I do think that one of the things about this measurement and capability is that collaboratively, I think that there's an awareness issue. It's no good me saying, QS, that's your problem. If I understand it, that will get a benefit. And
I think it goes deeper than that. Yeah, it's not about awareness. There's this, you talk about this fundamental shift towards BIM standards and ISO standards, and I'm also very pro these ISO standards. But ISO standards come one at a cost, and not every country. Or you talk about the residential QS architecture, they're not interested in ISO. And above all that, every country across the globe has its own legislative, cultural, and policy drivers. And again, let's not discuss culture being the most significant, but parking the culture. Many regions still around the globe are adopting this vanguard of BIM, the UK being, one of the indoctrinators. But it's mostly with the architects and occasionally governments that are pushing this initiative. We keep hearing about 4IR and machine learning and all those fancy new terms of digital twins and smart cities. Yet, we have to recognize that the efficiency gains through adoption of technology and design tools is a tool to visualize and coordinate. And now we're throwing standards into it. We're still trying to get the quantity survey to understand what the value of an elemental is. We talk about new rules of measurement. We talk about standard method of measurement. There still are BIM experts, in commas, talking about that my model automates a bill of quantities. Yet they don't know the difference between what the bill of quantities is versus the schedule of quantities. There's no software in the world that can generate a bill of quantities. It's not possible. It can do a schedule of quantities. Yet we're not even talking the right policy in terms, but the rest of the world is talking about BIM standards. You see where I'm going with this? There's a link that's missing.
Okay, so one of the things that's just come out just recently, and it's about the modeling. Now, and in particular, a bespoke residential period building. It's a expensive building. And one of the things about doing conservation or period type buildings is the level of detail that goes in. Now, not LOD, we're talking about architectural detail. The period features, the columns, the capitals, how brickwork and stonework interacts, etc. And that's exactly, that lends credibility to what you're saying about you can't extract the bill of quantities out of it. You can get the schedule. But if the modeling's not right, and in particular, where it occurs in the work stages within the project lifecycle. But I think I'm going to wind it back to the level of information need. And that really is a whole team requirement. That's the definition. There is so much redundant work going on where we provide information regularly. I need COBE, I need this, I need IFC. And then you say, well, what are you going to do with it? And that's the redundancy of it, is that you prepare these documents, you populate them from the model, you'd have some manual bits and pieces, you get it all working, and then it's not even used. Don't waste that time. And that's where that defining the boundaries really it has been, for me, a big chasm that we're now looking at jumping, because when we do that, it's much clearer what the team's going to provide.
Absolutely.
The issue of LOD and the numbers, and here it's a single digit, there it's 3 digits, and it's more about understanding what it is that we're putting together. So if you went back to the previous view, that traditional part of the building, and we assemble a number of things, but we need to understand that at the concept stage, what are we providing? 2 lines to indicate that it's a bounding wall. And then as we go, we aggregate more and more information into this, and more graphical information, which is explaining. Ultimately, an exercise I like doing is no annotations on the drawing. I know that that's a brick wall, and I know that that's a block wall, because the symbol is standard. And guess what? I go and take 3 different projects, and I've got 3 or 4 different representations. So again, that muddies the water. So
yeah,
the level of information need really opens up that door to say, what is it that we're going to be doing? Quick analogy, regularly people say to me, what do you want BIM to do for you? And people end up saying, well, I need this, I don't need this, I don't need that. I want to take it the negative way. What don't you want BIM to do for you? And that's cutting.
Yeah, I think that's a total different topic of discussion. I couldn't agree with you more. But I look at, for example, those points that you just mentioned, and I understand where you're coming from when you talk about the value of information that's coming out of the models. But these are the challenges and the obstacles as a QSC faces when you give him this model. He's got these issues with quantity definitions. He's got issues with the type, even versus the instance in, let's say, Revit. And then he's got what to do with this whole thing about poor modeling. And that file format, you spoke about Kobe, you spoke about IFC. IFC, I want to pull out my alcohol when I hear that word. It's just, it drives me to drink sometimes when I hear people talking about, we'll give you the IFC model. Well, was Revit set up correctly with IFC schema when the project was set up in the BIM execution plan? Oh, that would have been the BIM modeler's job. Oh, really? Or the BIM manager, or the BIM lead, or the architect lead. Whose job was it, and was it done correctly? Because again, the document was read once. That BEP was read once. In fact, the QS never even got to read it. Yet, he's just thrown this model and thrown into the deep end. He has to now do these quantity definitions. And we all know how a QS works. And he doesn't trust the QS. He does not trust the architect's quantity. So by all means, I'm a QS, I know. Give it to me in 2D. And I will go back and I will measure exactly what you see is what you get. And this is, I think, going to be the biggest challenge that we face in this industry, is not just necessarily understanding what the role of a quantity surveyor is, but it's more understanding what the role of the model is going to do for the quantity surveyor when you give it to him. And that's a debate I think we could open again in the series to come. But
no, absolutely.
Yeah.
So I'm going to interject there and just say, clearly the issue of definitions. One of the things is it the length? Is it the width? Is it the depth? Is it the thickness? And those appreciations across the industry are so diverse that we use the terms in various manners. We also have the problem of, in particular in the BIM standards, is the fact that different languages interpret things in different ways. So we get 5 fields, 5 parameters with the same purpose, but with a different title or a different naming convention. So we can use the camel case, we can use uppercase, whatever. All of those different things to the computer can be very different. But the next part is that with that modeling is the freedom that we have between type and instance, as an example. That immediately gives us the ability to either ring fence things really firmly.
Yeah.
And then when we apply that over the lifetime of the project, at the beginning, I want to have the instance base where I can make it bigger and smaller.
Yeah.
But there's an organization here that is a leader in the UK, and they've done some amazing work on breaking down the IFC. I'm going to use a term, the open BIM, also immensely powerful about IFCs. And that is this whole thing of interoperability. Can I get it out? And does it tell me what it is? Succinctly, understandably, change the languages around the world, but it is a door. It is a chunk of concrete.
Yeah.
And if we don't get that standardization working, then everybody else starts suffering badly with that.
Yeah.
The example that I'm going to use is that same project is offering a model, offering schedules in a data table format. And then at the same time, because it's early on in the project, there's no annotations for the QS to be able to glean information. So what the benefit suddenly accrues is by giving out an IFC model or in another platform, and in this case, just Deluxe, I just used it as a viewer. But what it's offering that QS is the ability to interrogate something by clicking on it and gleaning whatever information is there, which typically wouldn't be there. And if that can improve his engagement, I'm winning. The whole team is winning.
Yeah. And I think we reached that 30-minute mark where I think we probably would have lost a lot of our listeners after even 10 minutes, because that's the concentration span when people come on social media. And I want to raise that last slide that we had, because I want to go back to that debate with you in the next series, because I think it's a very hot topic at the moment among most people that are facing this frustration. So if you're up for it, I'm going to take you up on the next series where we talk about that particular issue of modeling obstacles.
Most certainly.
Whether we embrace it or not, I think this change is inevitable, and at some point, as an individual or a company, we're going to have to redefine or even reset yourself, even in this old way of working. Much of the old grind, as I say, has been automated, leaving us to make up our own ways of staying alive or just becoming, intuitive. So I welcome that in that next series. And I think this has been great. I'm loving this. It's a hard-hitting reality. And the whole idea about this is that. And as I said, I've got to add that in. It's just where do you find an exceptional QS? Go to exceptionalbim.com. But guys, please like and subscribe. Please follow Pierre. I'm really looking forward to the next series, and we hope to see you guys soon. Thanks, Pierre.
Excellent. My pleasure.